The clock on the wall read 10:47 p.m. when Robert pushed open the glass door of the diner. A small bell chimed above his head, announcing his arrival to the handful of people still inside at this late hour. The place wasn't much to look at. Red vinyl booths lined the windows, their seats patched with duct tape in spots where the years had worn through. The black and white checkered floor had lost its shine decades ago, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed just loud enough to notice if you paid attention. Robert was a big man, standing well over 6 feet tall with a build that came from years of hard work and good eating. His dark skin glistened slightly from the summer heat outside, even though the air conditioning inside the diner fought hard to keep the temperature down. He wore a simple gray t-shirt and jeans with comfortable sneakers that had seen better days. At 45 years old, he carried himself with a certain quietness that some people mistook for shyness, but those who really knew him understood it was something else entirely. He had been driving for nearly 8 hours straight, making his way across the country for a job interview that could change everything. The position was in Seattle, a long way from the small Alabama town where he'd grown up. It was a good opportunity, the kind that didn't come around often for men his age. Security consultant for a major firm, real money. A chance to use his skills in a way that mattered. But Seattle was still 2 days away, and right now all Robert wanted was a hot meal and a strong cup of coffee before finding a motel for the night. The waitress looked up from behind the counter as he walked in. She was somewhere in her 50s with tired eyes and blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail. Her name tag said, Betty. She gave him a small smile, the kind service workers give everyone, and gestured toward the empty booths. Sit anywhere you like, honey, she called out. Kitchen still open for another hour. Robert nodded his thanks and slid into a booth near the middle of the diner, not too close to the door, not too far back. Old habits. He always liked to see both exits, always liked to know who was coming and going. 20 years out of the service and some things never changed. He picked up the laminated menu from between the salt and pepper shakers. The usual diner fare stared back at him. Burgers, meatloaf, chicken fried steak, breakfast served all day. His stomach rumbled. He'd only stopped once since lunch, grabbing gas station chips that had done nothing but make him hungrier. Betty appeared at his table with a glass of water and a notepad. Up close, Robert could see the weariness in her face went deeper than just a long shift. This was someone who'd been working hard for a very long time. What can I get you, sweetheart? I'll take the meatloaf special with mashed potatoes and green beans, Robert said, his voice deep but gentle. And coffee, please, black. You got it, she scribbled on her pad. Pie's fresh if you want some after. We got apple and cherry. Apple sounds good. Thank you, ma'am. She smiled at the ma'am and headed back toward the kitchen. Robert let his eyes wander around the diner, taking in his surroundings the way he'd been trained to do so long ago. An older couple sat in a booth by the window, working their way through slices of pie in comfortable silence. The man wore a veteran's cap, navy from the looks of it. His wife had her hand resting on the table near his. Not quite touching, but close enough. 60 years together, maybe more. Robert felt a familiar pang. He'd never managed to make a relationship last. Not with the way he'd lived his life. Then there was the other group, 5 young men, probably in their 20s, crowded into a large corner booth near the back. Empty beer bottles cluttered their table, which struck Robert as odd since he hadn't noticed a bar area. They must have brought them in, which meant Betty was probably too tired or too scared to say anything. The guys were loud, their laughter sharp and aggressive in the quiet space. They wore the uniform of small-town toughness, sleeveless shirts showing off tattoos, baseball caps, work boots. The kind of guys who peaked in high school and spent the next 20 years trying to reclaim that feeling of being on top. Robert had seen 1,000 guys like them. In every town and every state, there was always a group like this, usually harmless, just loud and drunk and stupid, but sometimes not. One of them, a guy with a shaved head and a tattoo of a snake crawling up his neck, caught Robert looking and stared back hard. Robert calmly returned his attention to the paper napkin he was folding, showing no reaction. Getting into a staring contest with drunk idiots wasn't on his agenda for the evening. Betty returned with his coffee, setting it down carefully. As she did, she leaned in slightly and spoke quietly. Sorry about those boys in the back. They come in here sometimes and act up. I already called my manager, but he says just let them be long as they don't break nothing. It's all right, Robert said gently. I'm just passing through. I'll eat and be on my way." She patted his shoulder gratefully and moved away. Robert wrapped his hands around the warm coffee mug and took a sip. It was diner coffee, strong and bitter, exactly what he needed. Through the window beside him, he could see his truck in the parking lot packed with everything he owned that mattered. Not much, really. Some clothes, a few books, his certificates and records from the service. A photo album his mother had made before she passed. You could fit a whole life into the bed of a pickup truck if you weren't too attached to things. The meatloaf arrived faster than expected, steaming and smothered in brown gravy. Betty set it down along with a basket of rolls and a small bowl of butter. "Anything else you need, you just holler." "This is perfect. Thank you." Robert ate slowly, savoring each bite. The food was simple but good, the kind of cooking that came from someone who'd been doing it for decades. The meatloaf was seasoned just right. The potatoes were real and not from a box, and the green beans had been cooked with bacon. This was honest food, made by honest people trying to make an honest living. Behind him, the group in the corner booth got louder. Their laughter had an edge to it now, that particular sound that comes when drunk people start looking for entertainment. Robert heard chairs scraping, someone dropping a bottle that didn't break. More laughter. He kept eating, keeping his body language relaxed but his awareness sharp. "Hey, look at this guy," one of them said, voice carrying across the diner. Sitting there stuffing his face like he owns the place. Robert didn't turn around. He cut another piece of meatloaf, speared a bit of potato with his fork. "I'm talking to you, big boy." The voice came again, closer now. "You deaf or just stupid?" The elderly couple by the window looked uncomfortable. The old man half rose from his seat, but his wife put her hand on his arm, shaking her head. Betty stood frozen behind the counter, her hand hovering near the phone. Robert set down his fork carefully and took another sip of coffee. His heart rate hadn't changed. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to start something with him, and it probably wouldn't be the last. Some people just couldn't leave well enough alone. "Leave him be, Travis," one of the other guys from the booth called out. "Let's just finish our drinks and go." Travis. So that was the ringleader's name. Robert filed that information away without turning around. "Nah, man. I don't like the way he's sitting here. Like he belongs or something." Travis was definitely drunk, his words sliding together slightly. "This is our spot. We've been coming here since we were kids." Robert heard footsteps approaching his booth. He looked up calmly as Travis appeared in his peripheral vision, leaning against the booth across from him. Up close, the guy looked even younger than Robert had thought. Maybe 24, 25, skinny despite the tough guy outfit, with eyes that couldn't quite focus properly. The snake tattoo on his neck was amateur work, probably done by a friend in someone's kitchen. Behind Travis, his four buddies had gotten up too, forming a loose semicircle. Backing up their friend, showing strength in numbers. Classic pack behavior. "Can I help you with something?" Robert asked quietly, his tone neutral. "Yeah, you can help me," Travis said, his voice mocking. "You can take your fat behind somewhere else. We don't want you in here." Betty finally found her voice. "Travis Mitchell, you leave this man alone right now." "I will call your uncle, I swear I will." Travis laughed. "Go ahead and call him, Betty. Uncle Jim's the sheriff." "You think he's gonna side with this guy over me?" He turned his attention back to Robert, emboldened by having an audience. "You hearing me? I want you gone." Robert looked at Travis steadily, keeping his face expressionless. He'd learned a long time ago that showing emotion only made things worse with guys like this. They fed on fear and anger equally. "I'm just trying to have my dinner," Robert said calmly. "I don't want any trouble. I'll be done in about 10 minutes and then I'll be on my way." 10 minutes? Travis leaned forward, putting his hands on Robert's table. "How about 10 seconds? One of Travis's friends, a shorter guy with a red beard, grabbed his arm. "Come on, man. Let's just go." This is stupid, but Travis shook him off. The alcohol and ego and whatever else was driving him had taken over completely now. Robert recognized the look. He'd seen it before, in bars overseas and training exercises in combat situations. This was a man who'd made up his mind to prove something, and logic wasn't going to change that. Robert slowly pushed his plate away and set his napkin on the table. He reached for his wallet, pulling out a $20 bill and setting it beside his coffee cup. Enough to cover his meal and a good tip for Betty. "I'm leaving," he said quietly. "No problem." He started to slide out of the booth, moving carefully and deliberately. For a moment it seemed like that might be enough. Travis stepped back slightly. a look of satisfaction crossing his face at having run someone off. But then, as Robert stood to his full height, something shifted in Travis's expression. Maybe it was seeing how much bigger Robert really was. Maybe it was feeling like he needed to save face in front of his friends. Maybe it was just the beer talking. Whatever it was, Travis's hand shot out and shoved Robert's shoulder hard. The coffee cup tipped over, sending black liquid streaming across the table and onto the floor. The sound of it hitting seemed very loud in the sudden silence of the diner. Robert looked down at the spreading pool of coffee, then back up at Travis. His expression hadn't changed, but something in his eyes had shifted. Something old and deep and very, very calm. That was a mistake, Robert said softly, and everyone in the diner suddenly realized that the quiet, polite man eating meatloaf was something else entirely. The coffee continued to drip off the edge of the table, making a steady rhythm against the checkered floor. Nobody moved. The buzz of the fluorescent light seemed louder now, filling the space where conversation should have been. Travis stood there with his hand still extended from the shove, a grin starting to form on his face. He thought he'd won. He thought he'd proven something to his friends, to Betty, to the old couple by the window. He thought he'd put this stranger in his place. He had no idea what he'd actually done. Robert stood perfectly still, his large frame relaxed but somehow coiled at the same time. His breathing was steady, measured. Anyone who'd served in combat would have recognized that posture immediately. It was the stance of someone who'd been in tight situations before, someone who knew exactly what their body could do and was deciding whether or not to do it. "You gonna cry about it?" Travis said, his confidence growing with each second that Robert didn't react. He turned slightly toward his friends, playing to his audience. "Big man's gonna cry over some spilled coffee." His buddies laughed, but it was nervous laughter. The red-bearded one, Danny, took a step back. Something in his gut was telling him this wasn't going to end well. He'd been friends with Travis since middle school, had backed him up in a dozen stupid fights, but this felt different. The big guy hadn't flinched, hadn't gotten angry, hadn't done anything except stand there with those calm, watchful eyes. "Travis," Danny said quietly, "let's just go, man. We got work in the morning." "Work?" Travis laughed harshly. "Since when do you worry about work? We're having fun here." He stepped closer to Robert, emboldened by his friend's presence behind him. "What's wrong, big boy? You scared? That why you're not saying nothing?" Robert finally spoke, his voice low and even. "I'm going to ask you one more time to step back and let me leave." "I don't want to do this." "Do what?" Travis spread his arms wide in mock confusion. "You gonna do something? You gonna teach me a lesson?" He looked back at his friends again. "Boys, I think this guy's threatening me. What should I do about that?" A skinny kid with acne scars and a mullet spoke up. "Teach him some respect, Travis. Show him how we do things around here." Betty had her phone in her hand now, her fingers shaking as she tried to dial. "I'm calling the police right now. You boys need to leave before someone gets hurt." Travis ignored her. His uncle would handle it if the cops showed up. Uncle Jim always did. That was the advantage of being family with the sheriff in a small town. You could get away with a lot. The old man by the window stood up slowly, his Navy veteran's cap sitting straight on his head. "Son, you need to walk away. Right now, while you still can." Something in the old man's voice made Travis pause. It carried authority, the kind that came from years of telling men what to do and having them listen. But Travis was too far gone now, too committed to backing down. "Stay out of this, old man. This ain't your business." Robert's eyes flicked to the elderly veteran and something passed between them. A recognition. A shared knowledge. The old man gave a slight nod and sat back down, pulling his wife close. He knew what was coming. He'd probably seen it before, maybe had been part of it himself decades ago in some foreign country, whose name most people couldn't pronounce. "Last chance," Robert said to Travis. "Walk away." Instead, Travis reached out and jabbed Robert in the chest with his finger. Once, twice, 3 times. Hard pokes meant to provoke, meant to demean. "Make me," Travis said, his face inches from Robert's now. "Come on, fat boy. Make me walk away." What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but everyone who witnessed it would remember it in slow motion for the rest of their lives. Robert's hand moved so fast it was almost a blur. He caught Travis's finger mid-jab, twisted it in a smooth motion that made Travis yelp in pain, and used the momentum to spin the younger man around. Before Travis could even process what was happening, his arm was locked behind his back at an angle that made his shoulders scream in protest. His cheek was pressed against the table where Robert had been eating, his face inches from the spilled coffee. The entire movement was controlled, precise, and absolutely devastating in its efficiency. "I told you it was a mistake," Robert said quietly, his voice unchanged. There was no anger in it, no triumph. Just a statement of fact. Travis's friends stood frozen for a heartbeat, trying to understand how their tough guy leader had ended up face down on a table in the span of a blink. Then instinct kicked in. "Get off him," the mullet kid yelled, rushing forward with his fist cocked back. Robert saw him coming, of course. He'd been tracking all of them with his peripheral vision, the way he'd been trained to track multiple threats in hostile territory. He released Travis with a controlled shove that sent him stumbling into a chair, then turned to face the new attacker. The punch came in wild and looping, telegraphed from a mile away. Robert stepped inside it, deflected it with his forearm, and delivered a short, sharp jab to the kid's solar plexus. Not hard enough to cause real damage, but hard enough to knock all the air out of his lungs. The kid dropped to his knees, gasping like a fish out of water. "Stop. Everybody stop." Betty was yelling now, her phone pressed to her ear. "I've got the police on the line." But things had gone too far to stop now. The other three were coming at him together, whether out of loyalty to Travis or just mob mentality. Robert's mind shifted into a mode he hadn't accessed in years, muscle memory taking over from conscious thought. This was what 20 years of Marine Corps training looked like when it needed to. The first guy grabbed for Robert's arm. Robert let him get the grip, then used the connection to pull him off balance and into a hip throw that sent him crashing into an empty booth. The vinyl seat cushion absorbed most of the impact, but the guy still hit hard enough to see stars. The second attacker, bigger than the others and probably thinking his size mattered, charged in low, trying to tackle Robert around the waist. Bad strategy against someone who'd been trained in close-quarters combat. Robert sprawled his legs back like a wrestler, stuffed the takedown attempt, and used his weight to drive the guy face first into the floor. Not the gentle linoleum of a home kitchen, but the hard, unforgiving floor of a commercial diner that had been there since 1975. The guy's nose made a sound like a snapped twig. Danny, the red-bearded one, was the only one who hadn't attacked yet. He stood there with his hands half raised, torn between helping his friends and recognizing that this was a fight they couldn't win. His eyes were wide, taking in the carnage of the last 10 seconds. 3 of his friends were down. Travis was just now getting back to his feet. And the big man they'd thought would be an easy target was breathing normally, his shirt not even untucked. "Don't," Robert said to Danny, his voice still calm. "Don't make me hurt you too. Just stay where you are." Danny nodded slowly, his hands coming all the way up in surrender. He'd seen enough. This wasn't like the usual bar fights where everybody threw wild punches and maybe somebody got a black eye. This was something else entirely. This was professional, but Travis wasn't done. His shoulder hurt like hell, his pride hurt worse, and all he could think about was how his friends had just gotten destroyed and he was supposed to be the tough one. He pulled something from his pocket, and the click of the blade opening seemed loud in the sudden quiet. "Travis, no!" Danny shouted, but it was too late. The knife was a cheap folding blade, the kind you could buy at any gas station for $15. In Travis's shaking, angry hand, it looked dangerous, but to someone like Robert, it was just another problem to solve. Travis came in slashing, the blade cutting through the air in wide, uncontrolled arcs. Dangerous to bystanders, predictable to professionals. Robert backed up 2 steps, his eyes never leaving the knife, tracking its movement. He'd been trained in knife defense at Quantico, had practiced it hundreds of times with rubber knives, and then carefully controlled scenarios with real ones. The key was controlling the weapon hand, neutralizing the threat, staying calm. On Travis's third slash, Robert moved. He stepped inside the arc of the blade, caught Travis's wrist with both hands, and applied pressure to a nerve cluster that made Travis's entire arm go numb. The knife clattered to the floor, spinning away across the linoleum. In the same motion, Robert swept Travis's legs and took him down, controlling the descent so he landed hard but not dangerously. Then Robert did something that shocked everyone in the diner. He stepped back. Didn't kick Travis while he was down. Didn't keep hitting him. Just stepped back and stood there, breathing steadily, his hands loose at his sides. "It's over," he said. "Stay down." Travis lay on the floor, his eyes watering from the pain in his wrist and the humiliation of being beaten so thoroughly. His friends were scattered around the diner in various states of hurt and shock. The mullet kid was still gasping for air. The big guy was holding his broken nose, blood streaming between his fingers. The one who'd been thrown into the booth was groaning, trying to remember what day it was. And Danny just stood there with his hands up, looking at Robert like he was seeing a ghost. The sound of sirens cut through the night air outside. Betty had gotten through to the police and they were close. Must have been patrolling nearby. Robert walked calmly back to his booth, picked up the $20 bill from the puddle of spilled coffee, and set it on the counter instead. Then he sat back down and waited, his hands visible on the table, his posture relaxed. The elderly veteran caught his eye and gave him a small nod of respect. One warrior to another. The old man's wife clutched her purse, eyes wide, but she wasn't looking at Robert with fear. She was looking at Travis and his friends with disgust. Betty came out from behind the counter, stepped over the groaning bodies, and refilled Robert's coffee cup with hands that barely shook. She set it down in front of him carefully. "On the house," she said quietly. "Thank you, ma'am." 3 police cars pulled into the parking lot, their red and blue lights painting the diner windows in alternating colors. Car doors slammed. Heavy footsteps approached. Robert took a sip of his fresh coffee and waited. He'd been through this before, not quite like this, but close enough. The truth was on his side. The security camera in the corner of the diner had caught everything. Betty and the old couple would tell the truth. The evidence was clear, but he also knew how small towns worked. Travis's uncle was the sheriff. These were local boys, and Robert was a stranger, a black stranger at that, in a place where strangers weren't always welcome. The door burst open and 4 officers rushed in, guns drawn, shouting commands, "Hands where we can see them. Nobody move!" Robert kept his hands on the table, flat and visible, and didn't move a muscle. He'd been through this before, too. The trick was to stay calm, stay compliant, and let the truth come out. A 5th man entered behind the uniformed officers, and Robert knew immediately this was Travis's uncle. Same jaw, same build, wearing a sheriff's uniform with too many campaign pins on it. His name tag read Sheriff Mitchell. His eyes swept the scene, taking in his nephew on the floor, the other boys scattered around, and Robert sitting calmly at his booth drinking coffee. The sheriff's face hardened. "That's him," he said, pointing at Robert. "Arrest him." And that's when Betty spoke up, her voice shaking but firm. "Now you hold on just a minute, Jim Mitchell. Your nephew and his friends attacked this man. I saw the whole thing. He was defending himself." The old veteran stood up again. "She's right, Sheriff. Your boy started it. This man here tried to walk away multiple times. They wouldn't let him." Sheriff Mitchell's jaw clenched. "That's not what I'm seeing. I'm seeing 5 local boys injured and 1 outsider sitting pretty." One of the younger officers, a black woman with sergeant's stripes, stepped forward. "Sheriff, with all due respect, we should check the security camera before we make any arrests. And we should get statements from all witnesses." The sheriff glared at her, but he couldn't argue with procedure, not with everyone watching. "Fine, but I want that man's information. License, registration, everything." Robert slowly reached for his wallet, moving carefully so no one would mistake his intentions. He pulled out his driver's license and handed it to the sergeant, not the sheriff. She looked at it, then at him, then back at the license. Something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, maybe, or respect. "Sir, is there anything else you need to show us? Any documentation about your background?" Robert understood what she was asking. He reached into his wallet again and pulled out a worn card, his military ID, retired status. He handed it to her. The sergeant's eyes widened as she read it. She showed it to the sheriff, who snatched it from her hand and stared at it like it might be a forgery. "Marine Corps," the sergeant said quietly. "Staff sergeant. 2 combat tours. Honorable discharge." The whole tone of the scene shifted in that moment. The other officers, several of whom were probably veterans themselves, looked at Robert differently. One of them actually nodded in respect, but Sheriff Mitchell's face just got redder. "I don't care what he did 20 years ago. He assaulted my nephew and his friends in my town." "Your nephew pulled a knife on him, Jim," Betty said, pointing to where the blade still lay on the floor. "That's a felony." Everything hung in balance then. The sheriff standing there with his authority and his anger. The sergeant with her by-the-book procedures and quiet support. Betty and the old couple with their eyewitness testimony. Robert with his calm dignity and his record of service. And 5 local boys groaning on the floor, bleeding and bruised and caught red-handed by a security camera. The next few minutes would determine whether Robert spent the night in a cell or back on the road to Seattle. Whether justice would be served or whether small-town corruption would win out. The sergeant walked over to the security camera and pointed up at it. "That camera working, Betty?" Betty smiled for the first time since the whole thing started. "Records everything. Sergeant Davis, everything." Sergeant Davis pulled a chair over to the corner of the diner and stood on it carefully, reaching up to examine the small black camera mounted near the ceiling. It was one of those modern systems, the kind that recorded everything to a cloud server. Betty had insisted on installing it after a robbery 3 years back. Best $200 she'd ever spent. "It's on," Davis confirmed, stepping down from the chair. "Looks like it's got a clear view of the whole dining area." Sheriff Mitchell's jaw worked like he was chewing on something bitter. His nephew Travis was sitting up now, cradling his wrist against his chest, shooting hateful looks at Robert between grimaces of pain. The other boys were in various states of recovery. The one with the broken nose was being tended to by a paramedic who'd arrived with the last police car. The mullet kid had finally caught his breath and was sitting in a booth looking pale and shaken. "Betty, I'm going to need access to that footage," Davis said, pulling out her phone. "Can you pull it up for me?" Betty was already moving behind the counter, reaching for the tablet she used to manage the system. "Give me just a minute. I have to log into the app." The sheriff stepped closer to Robert's booth, his hand resting on his belt near his weapon. It was meant to be intimidating, a show of authority. Robert had seen it 1,000 times from 1,000 different tough guys who thought a badge or a gun or a uniform made them more than they were. "You've got a lot of explaining to do," Mitchell said, his voice low and threatening. "I count 5 injured boys here and you don't have a scratch on you. That tells me all I need to know about who the aggressor was." Robert met his eyes calmly. "With respect, Sheriff, it tells you that I knew what I was doing and they didn't. There's a difference between being the aggressor and being better trained. You calling my nephew and his friends weak? I'm calling them young and drunk and stupid," Robert said evenly. "No shame in that. We were all young once, but they started this and your nephew pulled a knife. That's on them, not me." Mitchell's face flushed red. He opened his mouth to respond, but Davis interrupted from across the diner. "Sheriff, you need to see this." The tone in her voice made it clear this wasn't a request. Mitchell shot Robert one more hard look before walking over to where Davis stood with Betty, watching the tablet screen. The other officers gathered around, along with the old veteran who'd left his booth to stand nearby. Robert stayed where he was, his coffee getting cold in front of him. He could hear their voices but couldn't make out the words. He watched their faces instead. That told him everything he needed to know. Betty's face was grim but satisfied. Davis looked professional, taking notes on her phone. The other officers exchanged glances, and one of them, a younger guy with a crew cut who couldn't have been more than 25, shook his head slowly. The veteran just nodded like he'd expected exactly what he was seeing. "And Sheriff Mitchell?" His face went from red to purple to almost white as he watched the footage play out. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Play it again," he said quietly. "From the beginning." Betty tapped the screen and the playback started over. Even from across the diner, Robert could hear the audio. His own voice, calm and measured, asking Travis to step back. Travis's voice, loud and aggressive, calling him names that made Betty wince even hearing them a second time. The sound of the shove, Robert's warning. The attack, and then, very clearly, the click of the knife opening. The sheriff watched his nephew pull that knife on video, watched the whole fight unfold exactly as Betty and the veteran had described it. There was no ambiguity. No room for interpretation. The camera caught everything. When it finished the second time, the diner was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the low moans of Travis's friends. Davis was the first to speak. "Sheriff, I need to inform you that based on this footage, I'm placing Travis Mitchell and his associates under arrest for assault, disorderly conduct, and assault with a deadly weapon. You should probably recuse yourself from this case given the family relationship." Mitchell's voice came out strangled. "Now hold on. We can handle this quietly. No need to make a big thing out of it. Boys will be boys. Maybe everybody just goes home and we forget this happened." "Can't do that, sir." Davis's voice was firm but respectful. "We've got video evidence of a felony assault, and given the language used during the attack, there may be hate crime enhancements involved. This goes beyond a small-town dispute." The words hate crime seemed to hit Mitchell like a physical blow. His whole body sagged. because he knew what that meant. State prosecutors, federal attention maybe, the kind of scrutiny that would show every corner of how he ran his department, every favor he'd ever done for his nephew, every time he'd looked the other way. Travis seemed to understand it too. "Uncle Jim, do something," he called out, his voice cracking with panic. "You can't let them arrest me. Tell them it was just a misunderstanding." Mitchell closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, he looked 10 years older. "Travis, shut up. Don't say anything else without a lawyer." "But Uncle Jim," "I said shut up." The sheriff's voice cracked like a whip across the diner. Travis went quiet, tears starting to roll down his face. Not from pain now, but from the realization that his uncle wasn't going to save him this time. Davis walked over to Robert's booth, her expression professional, but not unkind. "Sir, I apologize for the initial response. Based on the evidence, it's clear you acted in self-defense. We'll need a statement from you, but you're free to go whenever you're ready." "I'd like to give a statement now," Robert said. "Get it done while everything's fresh. Appreciate that." She pulled out her phone and opened a recording app. "This is Sergeant Linda Davis, badge number 4729, taking a statement from—" She glanced at his license still in her hand. "Robert James Washington, regarding an incident at Betty's Diner on the night of June 15th. Mr. Washington, can you describe in your own words what happened here tonight?" Robert laid it out simply and clearly, the way he'd been trained to give after-action reports. Just the facts in chronological order, with no editorial or emotion. He described sitting down, ordering food, noticing the group in the corner, the escalation of their behavior, his attempts to defuse the situation, the physical assault, his defensive response, the knife, everything. While he talked, the other officers were cuffing Travis and his friends, reading them their rights. Travis kept crying, kept looking at his uncle like he couldn't believe this was happening. The mullet kid was screaming about how his dad was a lawyer and they were all going to be sued. The big guy with the broken nose just stayed quiet, probably realizing that talking would only make things worse. Danny, the red-bearded one who'd tried to get Travis to leave, was sitting in a booth with his head in his hands. An officer stood nearby but hadn't cuffed him yet. Davis noticed and paused Robert's statement. "The witness indicates one of them tried to stop it?" She called over to Betty. Betty nodded. "The one with the red beard. Danny Grierson. He tried to get Travis to leave before it started, and he didn't attack this man. Just stood there with his hands up." Davis walked over to Danny. "Mr. Grierson, I'm going to need a statement from you as well. If your account matches what we're seeing on video, and if you didn't participate in the assault, we might be able to work something out with the prosecutor. But you need to be completely honest with us." Danny looked up, his eyes red. "I'll tell you everything. Travis has been looking for a fight for weeks now, ever since he got fired from the plant. I told him we shouldn't come here tonight. I told him to leave that man alone. But he wouldn't listen. He never listens." "Save it for the formal statement," Davis said, but her tone had softened slightly. She walked back to Robert and resumed recording his account. When Robert finished, Davis saved the recording and handed him a business card. "If you need anything else, or if you want to press charges formally, you can reach me at this number. The state's attorney will probably want to talk to you as well." "Will I need to come back for a trial?" Robert asked. "Possibly. Depends on if they take a plea deal." Davis glanced over at Travis, who was being loaded into the back of a police car, still crying. "Given the video evidence, I'm guessing they will. Nobody wants this going in front of a jury." Sheriff Mitchell stood by his patrol car, radio in hand, his whole body language screaming defeat. He'd have to report this incident. Have to explain to his superiors why his nephew was being arrested for a hate crime assault. Have to face questions about whether he'd enabled this behavior, whether he'd let Travis get away with things before. His career was probably over, or at least seriously damaged. Part of Robert felt bad for the man. But only a small part. The sheriff had been ready to arrest an innocent person to protect his family. That wasn't law enforcement. That was corruption. Betty came over to Robert's booth as the police finished loading the boys into various patrol cars. She had a to-go container in her hands and a fresh slice of apple pie inside. "You never got to finish your dinner," she said, setting it down in front of him. "And you sure didn't get your pie. This is the least I can do." "You don't owe me anything, ma'am." "Maybe not, but I'm doing it anyway." She sat down across from him, suddenly looking exhausted. "You know what the scary thing is? Travis and those boys have been coming here for years. I watched them grow up. I served them pancakes when they were in Little League. And I saw them turn into whatever that was tonight. Happens sometimes, Robert said quietly. Good kids go bad. Bad kids go worse. All you can do is hold the line when it matters. Is that what you did? In the Marines? That's what I tried to do. Robert looked out the window at the flashing police lights. Doesn't always work out the way you plan. The elderly veteran and his wife approached the table, the old man extending his hand. Name's Frank Donovan. Navy retired. This is my wife, Helen. We wanted to thank you before we left. Robert shook his hand, noting the firm grip despite the man's age. Nothing to thank me for, sir. There's plenty to thank you for. You could have really hurt those boys. You had every right to, legally and morally, but you didn't. You used exactly as much force as necessary and not one bit more. That's discipline. That's training. That's character, Frank smiled. Also, that hip throw was textbook. You've been out of the service long? 20 years, give or take. It doesn't leave you, does it? That training. That mindset. No, sir, it doesn't. Helen Donovan spoke up, her voice gentle. Will you be all right? Do you have somewhere to stay tonight? I'll find a motel down the road. I'm heading to Seattle for a job interview. Still got 2 days of driving ahead of me. What kind of job? Frank asked. Security consultant. Big firm out there needs someone to assess their systems, train their people. Frank laughed. Well, after tonight, I'd say you're more than qualified. You just gave a live demonstration of exactly what good security looks like. They chatted for a few more minutes before the Donovans left. Frank pressing a business card into Robert's hand with his phone number on it. You ever need a reference, you call me. I mean that. One by one, the police cars pulled out of the parking lot, taking Travis and his friends to the county jail. Sergeant Davis was the last to leave. She stopped by Robert's booth on her way out. Mr. Washington, there's something you should know. This incident is going to make the news. Small town. Sheriff's nephew involved. Video footage of the whole thing. Probably hit the local stations by morning. Robert sighed. He'd hoped to avoid that, but he'd known it was possible. Guess I better call my interview contact in Seattle. Let them know before they see it online. Might not be a bad thing, Davis said thoughtfully. The way you handled yourself tonight? The restraint you showed? A lot of security firms would see that as a positive, not a negative. Shows you can handle a crisis without losing control. Maybe. Robert wasn't convinced, but he appreciated her trying. After Davis left, Betty locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed. It was nearly midnight now, well past normal closing time. She started cleaning up the diner, wiping down the tables, mopping up the spilled coffee, righting the chairs that had been knocked over in the fight. Robert stood to help, but she waved him off. You've done enough for one night. Just sit and enjoy your pie. He sat, but he felt useless watching her work. Old habits from the Marines. You cleaned up your own mess. You helped your team. You didn't let other people do your work. But Betty seemed to need this, to need the familiar routine of closing down her diner, restoring order after chaos. So Robert ate his pie slowly and let her work. When she finished, she poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from him. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes, ma'am. How did you stay so calm? I've seen men get in fights before, plenty of them. They're always angry, always red in the face, always yelling. But you looked like you were doing your taxes or something. How? Robert thought about how to answer that. In the Marines, they teach you that anger is a weakness. It makes you stupid, makes you sloppy, makes you dangerous to yourself and your team. So you learn to put it in a box, lock it away, and do what needs to be done without it. And you can just turn it off like that? Not turn it off. Control it. There's a difference. I was angry tonight. Those boys said things that made me want to hurt them badly. But acting on that anger wouldn't have helped anything. So I did what I was trained to do. I neutralized the threat with minimal force and waited for proper authorities. Betty shook her head in wonder. My ex-husband would have put all those boys in the hospital. He had a temper like you wouldn't believe. Got worse when he drank. Eventually I got tired of it and kicked him out. You did the right thing. Yeah. Took me too long to do it, though. She sipped her coffee. You married, Robert? No, ma'am. Came close once or twice, but it never worked out. The Marine Corps life? That was part of it. But mostly I think I'm just better on my own. Some people are meant for families and white picket fences. Others of us are meant to keep moving. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two people who'd shared an intense experience and were coming down from it together. Outside, the parking lot was empty except for Robert's truck and Betty's old Civic. The town was quiet, most people long since asleep. Finally, Betty stood up. "I should let you go. You've got a long drive ahead of you." Robert stood too, picking up his to-go container. "Thank you for the pie. And for standing up to the sheriff. Somebody had to." Betty smiled tiredly. "You be safe out there, Robert. And good luck with that interview. Something tells me you're going to do just fine." Robert walked out into the warm night air, the door chiming one last time behind him. He climbed into his truck, set the pie on the passenger seat, and sat there for a moment before starting the engine. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize. "This is Sergeant Davis. Forgot to mention, the diner's security footage is going to be public record once it's entered into evidence. Might want to get ahead of that story. Here's the number for a reporter I trust. She'll tell it fair if you want to talk." Robert stared at the number on his screen. His quiet drive to Seattle, his private interview, his fresh start. All of it was about to get complicated, but maybe Davis was right. Maybe getting ahead of the story was better than letting someone else tell it wrong. He saved the number and started his truck. He'd think about it tomorrow. Right now, he just wanted to find that motel and get some sleep. As he pulled out of the parking lot, he saw Betty through the diner window, still cleaning, still restoring order. She looked up and waved. Robert waved back and headed for the highway. Behind him, the town slept, unaware that by morning, everyone would be talking about what happened at the diner. And by the afternoon, the whole country would know. Robert woke up in a motel room that smelled like old cigarettes and cleaning solution. The mattress was lumpy, the pillows were flat, and the air conditioner rattled like it was trying to shake itself apart. But he'd slept in far worse places during his years in the service, so he didn't complain. At least it was clean and the door locked properly. His phone showed 6:47 a.m. He'd gotten maybe 4 hours of sleep, his mind too busy replaying the events at the diner to really shut down. Every time he'd started to drift off, he'd see Travis's face again, or hear the click of that knife, or feel that familiar rush of adrenaline that came with real conflict. He sat up and checked his phone properly. 17 missed calls, 32 text messages. His inbox was full of emails from addresses he didn't recognize. His stomach dropped. The first text was from his sister in Alabama, sent at 11:47 p.m. the night before. "Bobby, what happened? Someone just sent me a video of you fighting at a diner. Are you okay? Call me right now." The next was from an old Marine buddy he hadn't talked to in 3 years. "Bro, is that you in this video going around? Looking good out there. Those punks picked the wrong guy." Then from his cousin in Atlanta, "You're famous, cuz. Video has 2 million views already." Robert's hands felt cold. 2 million views. He opened his social media app, something he rarely used, and saw his notifications had exploded. Hundreds of tags, thousands of comments, countless shares of a video he hadn't even known existed. Someone had gotten the security footage from the diner, or maybe it had been leaked, or maybe it was public record like Sergeant Davis said. Either way, it was everywhere. The video had been posted by a local news station around midnight with the headline, "Shocking. Marine veteran defends himself against armed gang in local diner." But that was just the beginning. Bigger outlets had picked it up. National news sites, social media influencers, everyone with an audience was sharing it, commenting on it, having opinions about it. Robert scrolled through the comments, his breakfast forgotten. This is what real training looks like. Controlled, precise, no wasted movement. The way he disarmed that knife was incredible. That's a warrior right there. Notice how he didn't hurt them more than necessary? That's discipline. That's what service teaches you. But there were other comments too. Why was he even in that diner? Probably looking for trouble. 5 against 1 and he barely got touched. Something's not right about this story. The media always makes veterans look like heroes. What about those boys? They have families too. Robert closed the app and set his phone face down on the nightstand. This was exactly what he'd hoped to avoid. The attention, the scrutiny, the endless opinions from people who weren't there and didn't understand. He took a shower, letting the hot water run longer than necessary, trying to wash away the tension in his shoulders. When he got out, his phone was ringing again. This time it was a Seattle area code. His interview contact, he answered, keeping his voice steady. "This is Robert. Mr. Washington, this is Patricia Chen from Sentinel Security Solutions. I'm calling about your interview scheduled for Friday. Here it comes, Robert thought. The polite cancellation, the "we've decided to go in a different direction" speech. He'd been through it before, though never quite like this. Yes, ma'am, I remember. I wanted to call personally because I've seen the video that's circulating online. I assume you know about it? Yes, ma'am. Just found out this morning. There was a pause on the line. Robert braced himself. Mr. Washington, I want you to know that this doesn't change our interest in interviewing you. In fact, if anything, it reinforces why we reached out in the first place. The way you handled that situation demonstrates exactly the kind of judgment and restraint we need in our senior consultants. Robert sat down on the edge of the bed, not quite believing what he was hearing. You're not canceling the interview? Absolutely not. However, I do need to ask you some questions about what happened, just for our records. Can you walk me through the incident? For the second time in 12 hours, Robert laid out the facts. Patricia listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Thank you for being straightforward about it. I've already had our legal team review the video and the police report. Everything you've told me matches what we're seeing. You acted in clear self-defense, you used appropriate force, and you cooperated fully with law enforcement. She paused. Mr. Washington, between you and me, this is the kind of real-world experience we can't teach. Most of our consultants have never been in an actual confrontation. They know theory, they know procedures, but they don't know how it feels when everything goes wrong. You do. So the interview is still on? It's still on. In fact, our CEO saw the video and wants to sit in on the interview personally. She's former Secret Service, and she was impressed by your technique. Patricia's voice warmed slightly. This might turn out to be the best job interview story you'll ever have. After they hung up, Robert sat there holding his phone, trying to process what had just happened. The thing he'd been dreading, the exposure and attention, had somehow worked in his favor. At least with the job. But the day was just getting started. By noon, Robert had been contacted by 3 different news organizations wanting interviews. A podcast host who focused on military stories. 2 different literary agents asking if he'd ever considered writing a book. And strangest of all, a Hollywood producer's assistant asking about film rights to his story. He ignored most of them, but he did call the reporter whose number S